My name is Greg Lobanov, and I'll be giving a talk today about gamifying creativity in Chicory, A Colorful Tale. So just to introduce myself really quickly, my name is Greg Lobanov. I'm a game designer, indie game designer living in Vancouver from Philadelphia. I've done a bunch of indie games before. The last couple I've done are like particularly relevant to the subject. So one I did in 2018 was called Wandersong. It was like a musical adventure game where you play as like a bard. It's a platformer where you can make music at any time. You're sort of a walking musical instrument and things interact with your music in different ways. And there's sort of like a story and puzzle solving element with that as well. And then the most recent game I released was called Chicory, A Colorful Tale, which came out in 2021. This one is a top-down sort of Zelda-like painting adventure game where the player explores this world, like a kind of Zelda-like world, and then they have this magic brush they can use to color things in. So the world is black and white, but the player can draw anywhere, anytime, and there's sort of like puzzle solving and adventure aspects with that brush. So both those games kind of mix creativity mechanics with like adventure game mechanics. And after working on both of those, I have quite a lot of experience in working with mixing creative mechanics with adventure game stuff. And that's why I wanted to talk about sort of the classic problem of what's sometimes called quantified creativity, which is known as a like cursed problem. I got really interested in this subject of cursed problems from this talk by Alex Jaffe in a previous GDC called Cursed Problems in Game Design. It's really, really good. I highly recommend it. But yeah, specifically, he talked about examples in this sort of like creativity thing. I'm going to now like kind of summarize what he summarized with it. So basically the idea is that you want to make a game that encourages people to be creative, right? But games also like sort of presuppose to introduce some kind of structure, right? They promise some sort of structure to a player. Like that's like what a game sort of is. And those things come into conflict almost right away because like things like, advancing through levels or earning points or like leveling up, progressing a character, whatever. These are all examples of extrinsic rewards, right? Like rewards you get for doing stuff from the game. But following your heart and expressing yourself and being creative, that is an intrinsically motivated activity, or it's something that people do when they are intrinsically motivated, right? It's something you do to like satisfy an internal need, and it's supposed to be fun for its own sake. In fact, it's been found like through study that if people are doing creative tasks and they're expecting a reward for it, they will tend to enjoy it less and they'll be less motivated to do it and they'll just be less creative in general. And like I've found, a lot of game designers have found, maybe you've probably found, that when players are offered like both extrinsic and intrinsically rewarding activities, they will tend to pursue the extrinsic rewards. Like those will tend to subsume the intrinsic ones. So like one example I can think of that is common to a lot of games are like clothes that have stats on them, like in RPGs. So often players will, come into conflict where they have clothes that they like the look of better, and there's clothes that give them better stats, and they have to pick between them. And almost always they're going to pick the ones that give them better stats, especially if the game is like challenging or like the stats are kind of the point of the game, right? It's like the aesthetic ends up just totally not being important, even though there are some players that really would enjoy wearing clothes that they like. So yeah, so like this is like the paradox that I've like dealt with a lot in my games, and the way that I've kind of learned to frame it for myself is basically that like I think that creativity can't coexist with logical problem solving, or like they just can't be mixed. So like one example that like showcases this specifically that I think is really interesting was in a game called Crayon Physics. This is not meant as a rag on that game because this is a really, really sweet game from a few years ago. But the idea of this game is that it's like a physics puzzle game. The player can draw whatever they want. And the things they draw become like kind of physics shapes that they can use to solve these puzzles where they're trying to get this like ball to the star. It's really, really fun. But the thing is that players, even though they can draw whatever they want, what they will tend to do is find one thing that they can draw that kind of solves the problem. In this case, like they'll just draw boxes in every level. And they'll just do the same thing over and over again because they figured out like that's, how to beat the game basically. Right. And so the game like even though they can do whatever they want, they're not motivated to do whatever they want. So even though they can draw anything, they're just going to draw stuff that solves the problems in front of them. Whereas what I was interested in was trying to find games that like motivate players to actually be creative and come up with stuff and self-express. But anyway, yeah, I mean, this is all a problem, but don't worry because I fixed it. And you can too. So the rest of this talk is going to be me talking about some of the ways that I found basically to work around or solve some of these conflicts that come up with this stuff. And the first one is to just like have both things there and you don't let them touch, right? Or in other words, like you separate all creative tasks from things that give you progress. So using my own games as examples, in Wandersong and Chicory, they are adventure games with stories. There's like a beginning, middle, and an end. There are places you explore and visit. There are puzzles you solve along the way. There are characters you help. All of this stuff are like you get clear objectives step by step that get you closer from the beginning of the story to the end of the story. And at no point in there do you have to do anything creative at all. It's actually all really standard adventure game structure stuff. Like if you played any Zelda game or Mario or something, right? Like you know what this is like. But there are tons of optional side activities. There are characters that will ask you to make art for them. In Chicory, there's like art classes you can go and do. There's just like lots of other stuff that is not actually part of the critical path. All of those are fully creative tasks. And yeah, so they just don't touch. They just don't touch. You have stuff you do to progress the game and you've stuff you do to be creative. And I actually think it's really good that both exist because I found that players generally need agency in how and when they engage with creative tasks because doing creative stuff is really exhausting. And like I point out, like when people are forced to do creative stuff, they will not enjoy it. Like if anyone who has played Chicory, if you can imagine, right? If there had been a requirement like, oh, to get to this next area, you have to color in 10 screens or something, right? I mean, people just wouldn't enjoy it. They would hate it. They'd resent it. They wouldn't enjoy doing it. They wouldn't enjoy creating that stuff, right? They would just be like checking the boxes. Whereas if you present them creative tasks that are like fully framed to them as being an optional thing, they know that they are choosing to do this optional thing. They feel their agency, like they know they have the choice to do that or not. They'll enjoy the task way more. They'll be more creative and expressive too, because they know that like their progress in the game doesn't hinge on their ability to do this or not. And that actually makes it way more enjoyable for them. The option, so problem solving, typical game structure tasks, basically, I think inhabit a really different part of the brain than creative things do. So like in a standard game structure, right, you're offering the player clear goals, you're giving them progress. And these are things that like stimulate them mentally and then exhaust them mentally, like solving puzzles or figuring out the simulation or whatever, navigating like a space. Whereas creative tasks, they're best when they're free form and expressive. You give them as few guidelines as possible and let them make stuff up. It's really fun and it's engaging emotionally, but also exhausting emotionally. And when you give them the option to have both and switch between doing both types of tasks, basically whenever they want, that is like ultimate power. It actually, I think, makes players enjoy both of those individual tasks way more because like they are always engaging with problem solving when they have the energy to do it. And then when they get tired of it, they have a different type of activity to do instead. And so sort of the flow back and forth between both like gives games this like really exciting energy to them. And they're like, when you generalize it this much, there are a lot of games that do stuff like this. So these are just some examples of games that, they incorporate some type of freeform creative mode where you can sort of make stuff. And then they have sort of an adventure, progress, simulation, puzzle solving mode or something. Both modes exist in these games and they are both part of the standard experience. So like a player will engage with both along the way. And I think it works really great. But so my like little like Greg's secret sauce is that for Wandersong and Chicory, the starting point was designing the creativity mechanic. And then the puzzle solving adventure stuff was sort of like made using those as like the puzzle solving mechanic. So basically you're always doing creativity stuff. And even when you're not, so that even when you are not actually doing a creative thing, like solving a puzzle in a dungeon, it actually still sort of feels like it is creative. And the line between these two things gets blurred a lot because you're using the same thing. So yeah, I think it actually tricks players into feeling creative and it changes their impression of the game like overall, right? Because they feel more like it is a creative game. Something that happens all the time when I have watched people play Chicory is they'll be like exploring around, they're solving a puzzle, they're on their way to something, and then for some reason their attention gets caught. And like maybe they notice that there's some new colors in an area, or they just like the look of a particular scene or something. They'll just hang out and they'll start drawing. And they'll spend a lot of time drawing, and like you'll almost like completely by accident, suddenly they're just doing creative stuff when they were supposed to be solving puzzles in a dungeon. I think the fact that like you can just these switches can just kind of happen anytime. It really does make the game really fun. It works really, really well. Um, and I think people should steal this idea straight up. I think if you own a AAA game studio, or if you can pitch to one and someone made like a big budget version of like this kind of game structure, I think you would do really, really well. But even if you don't have a big AAA game studio and you're just like a small indie person looking for some cool ideas, I give you permission. You should just take this. Like there's so many, I think there could be a whole genre of games that just do this. But anyway, okay, moving on. So you might be wondering if doing creative stuff doesn't give players progress in the game, then how do you motivate them to be creative? And my favorite answer to this question is with storytelling and role playing. So basically, what we do in Chicory and Wandersong is we create setups where players get to like deliver or give the punchline, right? So we give them like an open-ended prompt. We ask them to draw something. They draw something or make something, make a song, whatever. And then we give them like a really fun reaction to the thing they did, or we like reuse the thing they did in a different context. Like we give them some kind of fun interaction between those things. And so, yeah, like there's basically the players feel like they're in this really fun conversation with the game, right? And it gives them this opportunity to sort of role play, to insert themselves into the world, right? To see themselves reflected in the game space. And that is just like really fun. All of the like Chicory and Wandersong both, there's basically built out of these little like tons of little opportunities where players get to express themselves, like that example. And I think it, like when, even if, it's never mandatory, but when you give people the opportunity over and over again to express themselves, like even the most curmudgeonly person will end up doing it. And I think that's great because my goal is to give people like, yeah, that fun satisfaction of being creative and getting to do that in like a game context. So I just think like this sort of like conversational back and forth between players in the game using their creativity is just a really fun part of it. So in Chicory's 10-hour runtime, there are actually two places I broke my own rule where there is a creative task that is part of like the mandatory goals to get to the end of the game, but both of them are like very deeply contexted with a story and role-playing situation. So like one of my favorite parts of the game is a bit where Pizza, the main character on the left, and Chicory, the mentor character on the right, they sort of have this so your character asks Chicory, her mentor, to draw a picture of her. And so Chicory's drawing a picture of you, and the two characters are having this sort of like heartfelt conversation with one another. And then when the conversation is over and when Chicory's finished drawing you, she doesn't show you the drawing she did of you. Instead, she asks you to draw a picture of her first, and then you show the pictures to each other. And yeah, I think this is like, it's for me, one of the coolest parts of the game because it really puts the player in the character's shoes where they are drawing a picture of someone else and then having to sort of share and compare their art with someone else, which is a really fun activity. It makes the players feel like a lot closer to Chicory, the character, because they've sort of done this like mutual study with each other. And then of course the drawing that they do of Chicory is something that we get to bring back later in the story. So we get lots of value out of doing things this way. And I always think it's basically only works as a creative mandatory task because it is something that has all these storytelling context to it. And of course, also we give players total flexibility to put as much effort into it as they want. There's no like objection, like you have to fill in this much of the picture or whatever. Like players can literally submit a blank canvas if they want, right? So there is no like actual mandatory amount of work to it. It's just about sort of being in the moment and being in the character's shoes. Actually, like all of the drawings that we ask players to do, or most of them are, they're basically presented as a request from a character. And this sort of format actually works really well, I find, because when you are making a drawing for another character, you have a comfortable amount of distance from the piece where you have this opportunity to express yourself, but you also have sort of a goal in mind of trying to make something that will make that character happy, which is a ambiguous sort of goal or structure, but just enough that players basically get to decide how much they want to insert themselves into it versus like just follow exactly the guidelines they feel like the game wants from them. So they get agency there. But in doing all these tasks, they also just engage more with the story and the characters. Like they always feel more connected to a character drawing something for them. Like I think that's just cool. Another side note, so I think this is a good example of something where narrative design works really, really well to solve a problem that occurs in game design. And I think there's actually a lot of really cool potential things for this and lots of different genres of games where things that are generally accepted as like really tough game design problems could actually be solved by like a really cool storytelling idea. And there are a lot of great examples recently of games that do this. So like I think of the way that Celeste is a platformer that riffs on like classic platformer design with its story, or the way Inscription riffs on Slay the Spire or roguelike card games with its like kind of storytelling as well. These are both just really exciting examples that elevate like a classic known game design with a storytelling context. And yeah, I think if narrative designers are given opportunity to like direct design stuff, it would be really cool ideas. So just me. Anyway, moving on. So if you are making a game that requires the player to make creative stuff, like one very like obvious way to gamify that is to evaluate their art, right? So you give them prompt X and then you deliver like their piece Y and then you give them score Z. Makes sense, right? But I think that this is actually like really not fun at all, or definitely at least not as fun as people think it is. I think it's actually really degrading because it subconsciously encourages a player to basically change, like adjust their piece to improve their score, right? Generally by changing a superficial element. Because the way they're going to be thinking about this is like, oh, I got this score. Could I get a better score? Right. And then they're thinking about, okay, well, how do I adjust this to better meet whatever algorithm is deciding how my art gets rated? And then they're not thinking about expression anymore, right? They're thinking about logical problem solving. So but actually, even more importantly than that, I think it's just not fun. Like it's not interesting or challenging or subversive. Like if a player makes something that they care about and the game just tells them that it's bad, like it's just not enjoyable. I think it actually just makes people not want to try. And the thing is that you never know how a player feels about something that they've made for you, right? You don't know whether maybe they thought it was a total joke, but maybe they took it really seriously. Like maybe they really put their heart into this piece. You don't know. You have no way to evaluate that. And so there's just never a good reason to tell them they did a bad job. I think you should just always be nice. But there is something interesting here, right? Because they're like the thing that I think that is appealing about this experience that actually interests players is this idea that the game is like seeing what they did and then making like an observation about it. So we push into that a lot. I think you actually can get a lot of good interaction by giving players like kind of interesting observations about stuff they did. So to use Chicory as an example, like Chicory has art classes in it. And the basic format, right, is that, we give them a prompt, players draw sort of whatever, and then we give them like an evaluation, like an art critique afterward. And the way that it works is, right, the players submit this drawing and the game sort of like does this critical analysis internally of it. Like it divides it up into sections and just looks for like it makes a prioritized sort of list of just observations about it. So it might say like, ooh, this green color is the color you use the most. And like this area is darker than other areas on this drawing. And this area is lighter than other areas on the piece or whatever, right? These are all just like objective things the game can like measure about the artwork. And then it turns those, like it adds like a little bit of judgment or evaluation to it, and then like turns it into these kind of like statements about the piece that are like framed as an art critique. And things like this are really like gratifying and fun to hear as a player because, right, it really makes you feel like the game is noticing what you did and is reflecting that back to you. And that is what is really, really fun about it. We'll also mix, so like I'll mix comments like this that are like algorithmically generated with completely handcrafted comments that are based basically on the prompt the player was given. So a character might say like, oh, like my joy looks different from this, or like I don't understand what's going on in this piece, but I like that, whatever, right? So you kind of mix those things together, and the illusion altogether is something that really feels like the game is reacting to what the player is doing. It's really satisfying. So last thing that I want to talk about in this subject is about creating constraints for players. So like it's giving a player a constraint or like a goal with their piece can be really fun. But if you're scoring the player based on how well they meet the constraint you give them, then it basically leads to all the same issues I was talking about with like evaluating their art, where, then they're thinking about how to maximize their score for this evaluation, and they're not thinking about like how to actually express. So just like the twist that I make to this always is that rather than giving them like a constraint with like a goal to meet, we basically change their toolkit. We change what's actually possible for them. We make that the challenge, right? Because then it turns, instead of a like the constraint is like it's baked into the prompt. There's no way for them to fail at that, right? They're just given a box to work in. They get to creatively problem solve how to do something creative in that space. And I am generalizing a lot, but like an example that might be in Chicory is like you have to draw me a picture, but there's something on the canvas already. Or yeah, you only have these certain colors. Where you're drawing on a weirdly shaped surface that like doesn't, isn't a canvas or whatever, right? Like there are tons of these. And also what I really enjoy about this too is that like when you give players really great constraints, that's always a really fun storytelling opportunity where like you can be like, okay, so there's a guy in the game. You might as a designer say, oh, there's a guy in the game who wants you to draw a picture that's blue. And then you get to wonder like, why does this guy want a thing that's only blue? Like, and then you get to tell a story about like who this weird guy is that wants things that's only blue. Like maybe there's something nefarious going on. I don't know. The interaction between just sort of like weird game prompts and the storytelling opportunities, and also just creating lots of different constraints for different sorts of art projects. Like there is just so much depth in that type of gameplay. Whoop, I just went too far ahead. Sorry. There's so much depth in that type of gameplay. Like I think they're just basically, yeah, like it's a really fun way to make games, and a really great way to like basically give players lots of things to do that are sort of like feel more meaningful. So I don't know. Yeah. Free game design tip. In Chicory, so we had a lot of good outcomes, basically giving players very open-ended prompts, right? There are actually no constraints. We would just give them an open-ended prompt like express joy or draw like a cute creature or something. And this is really fun because again, players get to decide like how much to engage with the prompt and what they think fits that prompt. And they can't be evaluated on these. They're like not objectively evaluatable. But that sort of makes it fun. And yet it is fun, right? Like you would think, oh, like there's no, like you're just giving players space. Like why would they be motivated? But it is motivating because it's actually just fun to make stuff and to express yourself. So yeah, that's the gist. And then so I'm just going to summarize. Separate creativity from logical problem solving and game progression. Use story and characters and role playing opportunities to motivate player self expression. Never score or evaluate art, but do provide specific observations of choices that players have made, and can create constraints by varying the player's toolkit. That's the summary. So thank you, everybody. I was Greg. Yeah, I know I've finished a little bit fast, but so there's time now for questions and stuff if there are any. Sweet. I don't know if I can see the room or anything, so I'm just gonna like listen for.
Hi, great talk. I was wondering, I assume that you had some very interesting player feedback from this game, given like the completely open-ended portions of some of it. And I was just selfishly wondering if you had any like really favorite quotes that you've had from playtests.
Really favorite quotes. I don't know about like quotes. I definitely have a lot of really fun. I mean, like people who like if I look at like our Steam reviews, which is like a pastime if I'm ever feeling down about myself, I'll look at our Steam reviews. Like there's always tons of really good comments. People will be like, oh, I didn't think I'm not an artist. I thought I would hate this game because I don't like to draw. But it turns out I had a lot of fun drawing, and I actually like got in touch with that part again. And now sometimes I'm drawing for fun, like on the side. Like that kind of stuff is really gratifying for me to hear. That comes in lots of different flavors. I can't think of like a really specific quote about it, but that kind of flavor comes up a lot. And I do really appreciate hearing stuff like that because yeah, like I'm excited to get people like in touch with that part of themselves through games. I think that part is really cool. But yeah, I mean, everyone like the thing with it being open-ended is that everyone who plays these games, they have like a really different experience. Some people really just don't engage the creativity stuff like at all, or like a very minimum amount. And I think that that's okay because they still are exposed to it. I mean, they get a game they really enjoy, right? They play like a cool adventure game they get to the end of, and they just do some creativity along the way. And for some people, that is like the most they want out of it. And I think it's great that they can get that. Some people just forget to even finish the game and they just hang out drawing all day. And that's really cool too. Um, so I think both are great, and I think like appealing to both is also great, and helps lots of people.
And hi, I just wanted to ask. I loved Wandersong, and with a game like you said, like some people don't finish the game. There's so much to do in each area, and how you play around with the main mechanic. How do you pace the content of the game? Because I remember in Wandersong there were like worlds, and how do you decide like this is enough and the player can like move on?
I usually use story as kind of my grounding framework for deciding stuff like pacing, how to move people through stuff. So we think about like what's going on in the story, like how long has it been since the last like major story beat? How long do you want to be until the next one? And that's basically how we think about pacing things out. Um, so yeah, we want players to spend like a comfortable amount of time in each space, or as much time as they want. But then there's always like the drive, the thing that actually makes them move towards the ending is always like wanting to know what happens next. So you sort of like dole out like the story information at a good pace, and that's like a whole other subject. That's not really game design exactly. But yeah, like I think the story helps guide basically players through this like emotional journey through the game, and that guides how we pace the size of like different areas and stuff like that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi. So, if you could do away with every reason you had to keep the story at its current length and level of detail, what do you think you would add to it? I just like love the story so much.
Wait, okay. So if I could do whatever I want, like if I could just do whatever I want with the story and I'm not thinking about game design at all, is that what you mean? Huh. It's actually a hard question for me because well, so I think like I don't know if you are familiar, but the game I made, Wander Song, I think is like maybe one of the closest examples of this that I can think of, where I think I that kind of was the aim, where Wander Song is like not the most fun game, but every part of it, I allowed myself to make concessions where I really want the story to matter. So I'm going to use the game to sort of elevate the story. And sometimes the game will be sort of frustrating where I want the story to feel frustrating, or yeah, like whatever, right? I let that sort of be the guiding light. So that's kind of my closest version of it. It's hard for me to like totally extract them from each other because like what I enjoy about the process of these things is how they are in conversation with each other. So like it's hard for me to just think of story in a vacuum without having fun like game aspects to it. And the conversation between them, I think, is kind of partly what makes the stories like really, really fun. If I wanted to do it without having game design, I would just like try writing books, but I don't think I would be good at or enjoy writing books. It's a different sort of thing. So yeah, I don't know. I guess yeah, like maybe sometimes making concessions for like making the game less fun or the game design less interesting to present the story in a better light, I think is like the most concession I sometimes will make in this kind of issue. If that I don't know if that answers your question. I hope it does.
Yeah, that's cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi. So I'm just wondering, in the kind of dichotomy you set up between like separating the problem solving from creative tasks, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts for how do you like encourage creative problem solving, where you want people to solve problems, but like in creative ways, or if maybe that's kind of doesn't quite fit in this framework.
It's a really interesting question. And it is like, yeah, I think it's really, really hard. I mean, it's like the closer you get to making these things meet, the more you just get into so many weird, like, it always never quite goes the way you want. If I try to think of games that like are good examples of this, like okay, so when I think of games that have really creative problem solving in it, usually the things that seem to motivate it the most are games that are like extremely hard, and therefore to solve the problems, players will start working out of the box and doing unconventional things, right? Like, if I think about like, I mean, recent example I'm sure we all are familiar with, like Elden Ring, like the way that people play that game, everyone plays that game in a very different way because they're faced with a very, very difficult challenge. And that forces people to sort of like try different things, right? Or like act in weird ways, like, try to clip through walls or go around corners or skip sections. Like they will do things more creatively when they're sort of like compressed to a closer point. A lot of roguelikes, will also sort of encourage this type of thinking. But I do think like, like creative problem solving in that light, it's very different from the type of creativity that I'm talking about. So like I'm talking about, self-expression, and problem solving through self-expression is like really, really hard to force, I think, right? Because you can't like if the game is so hard that like players are thinking about how to solve it logically, then that is a different headspace, I guess, to be in. Um, Yeah, it's a hard problem. I hope that kind of answers your question.
Yeah, thanks.
I'm kind of curious at what point in development, and this might be more development sausage making question, like at what point in development did you start showing Chicory to people and getting feedback and evaluating whether your hypothesis of a game was worth pursuing further?
That's a good question. Well, so in the case of Chicory, I was showing it to I had close friends who I was showing it to very, very right. I would okay. The very, very first big question I had was just can I make a satisfying painting mechanic using a game controller? Because that already sounded like that just wasn't going to work. So I made prototypes where the player had an MS Paint screen with the paintbrush, and I was just trying different stuff the physics on the brush and colors and stuff to see if I could find kind of a fun version of that. And I was trying that with people right away because I wanted to make sure that the core interaction was fun. So just from that, I was showing it to people. But the thing is that drawing is really fun. Every single human being at some point in their life has drawn and had a good time doing it, which you can't really say for a lot of activities. So once I had a little drawing app that you could use to draw with a controller, people did enjoy playing that. I knew that was going to be fun. The question was how to sort of get people, trick people into doing that as often as possible. And as long as I was succeeding at doing that, then the game was fun. So I didn't have once I had the basic format for the structure in mind for a game that was going to do that, I didn't actually have a lot of questions that it was going to be fun. I think if you can find ways to mix this stuff, it is a fun thing, and it's not used very often. People aren't exploring the space that much, so I encourage it.
I had a question about sharing the creativity outside of the game, having tools to go on social media, and how it might change the motivation or the balances of the motivation, and what your thoughts were on the right balance there.
Yeah, well, so in Chicory, we included a button that lets people save a GIF of the stuff they do and post that to social media. That's our extent of it. We never prompt people to share stuff in the game. There's never a tweet this button. I do think that changes stuff because then you're creative performatively. And I actually think that one of the strengths, at least for Chicory, is that for players, it can be a really private thing. In fact, there were some streamers who I was really looking forward to watching play Chicory, and then many of them were actually, I don't think I'm going to play this game on stream because I'm having a really good time, and I just want to do something on pace. And the game sort of encourages that, and I think that's actually good. I mean, it's good for those people, right? Individually, I think it makes the game a better experience. So those are two different types of motivations, basically, for making things. Making stuff to share with other people is also fun. There are lots of games that do that really well. Jackbox is a game I can think of that is all about making stuff and showing it to people, right? Or Telephone or something. So those are really great examples of games that do that. I think they are motivating in a really different way though, because you're not really thinking about expressing yourself. You're thinking about how do I make the people in this room laugh or something, which is different, but interesting as well. And a totally cool space to explore. I haven't thought of mixing that with an adventure game kind of format the way I have here, but yeah. I think all that stuff is really, really interesting, and different ways of expressing this.
Thanks.
Hey, Greg. Great talk and amazing game.
Thanks.
I found when I was playing it, how much I'd bother to color in a scene would kind of fluctuate throughout playing, depending on my creative energy. And sometimes I'd really intricately color something, and sometimes I would just be I guess I got the colors in. And I guess it kind of went in line, maybe almost role playing, with the game. Yeah, I was interested in what were your observations of people playing and whether that fluctuated, and also kind of how do you account for people that might be completionists? And I definitely found a couple of times where I was obsessively painting something when I was tired, creatively tired, but because I wanted to be a bit of a completionist.
Right. Well, so we don't reward players for coloring things, and this is really important to me. And I mean, I was hoping that it would mitigate some of that a little bit, right? Because when you were testing this, there were a lot of people that were saying, hey, it would be really cool if when you color in the whole screen, something happens, there's just the character does a little dance, or you get a little star on the map or something, right? And I made really sure not to ever do that, because as soon as you have that, people will do all of them just by necessity. So I really tried to make sure that people knew that they did not have to do that. Like there was
You have characters appear though, don't you? When you
yeah, we reward them, but it was kind of meant to be like a surprise thing. And they don't show up for coloring the whole screen. They show up like you might not even color the screen like very much, and they might show up sometimes. So it was meant to like disconnect that a little bit. But yeah, I guess it does sort of like it does it right. I mean, it's tough. But it was something I was concerned about, like something that we did separate to that. But we have things in the game that are sort of intended as like when you get to certain points in the story, the game sort of prompts you to take a break. And that was another way that we were trying to say, like, hey, like if you've been playing for a while, like you should maybe stop for a bit. Like you were trying to find ways to insert like ways to encourage people to do that. But yeah, I mean, if it's really tough to like completely stop people from doing it. I mean, you give people the agency to draw as much as they want. Some people will draw more than they want to because like they just kind of like get into it. I have that problem playing lots of games. I would be super interested to like figure out ways to do it, but like to mitigate that as much as possible. Cause I when people are playing past the point of exhaustion, it's like not fun for them and they kind of lose some of the experience.
The
totally.
checkpoints worked well. I found I did stop playing at those checkpoints a lot of the time.
Awesome. I really appreciate hearing that then at least. But yeah, it was something we were concerned about and something we thought about. I hope that your experience was more good than bad.
Oh no, it's like my game of the year.
Okay, sweet.
All right, great. We're out of time. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you for all the great questions, everybody.